I think inequality and poverty in particular are critical issues. They're some of the most important issues of our time that I think affect how Americans across the United States and California in particular feel about society, feel about democracy, feel about where the country is headed. And I think the frustration that you see people expressing around the country is related to the fact not just of income inequality at a given point in time, the fact that there are some people in the country, a relatively small fraction of people who are doing extremely well, say the top 1%, and a large fraction who aren't seeing their fortunes improve as much as in the past, but also, importantly, a lack of opportunity, a feeling that in the past, if I worked hard, I could get ahead and achieve the American dream of moving up. But today, maybe that's not as possible for my children.
So why is upward mobility higher in some California cities than others?
There's a lot of variation in rates of upward mobility, kids' chances of achieving the American dream, if you'd like, across cities in California, across cities in the United States. There are some parts of America where kids' chances of climbing the income ladder are higher than anywhere else in the world. There are other parts of America where your chances of escaping poverty are lower than any place in the world. And so why is that the case? While it's difficult to figure out exactly what the recipe is for success in some place relative to others, we've looked in our research at what factors predict these differences, and we've identified 5 main characteristics of cities that have high levels of upward mobility. The first is that places that are less residentially segregated, where the poor and the rich are living in closer proximity, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. The second is that places with less income inequality, a larger middle class, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. The third is that places with more stable family structures, more 2-parent families, for example, tend to have higher levels of social mobility. And the fourth, somewhat related to that, is that places with more social capital. So think of the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. Will someone else help you out even if you're not doing well? Places that have a lot of social capital tend to have more mobility. And then the fifth, perhaps quite intuitively, is that places with better schools, better elementary schools, better higher education, tend to have higher levels of social mobility.
So overall, how does a person's childhood environment affect his or her economic success as an adult?
So we find that there are profound differences in your chances of climbing the income ladder based on where you grow up and what your environment looks like. In particular, if you look at kids who move to better areas, lower poverty neighborhoods with better schools when they're young, you see that they do dramatically better when they become adults. They're more likely to go to college, they have higher levels of earnings, they're less likely to have teenage pregnancies. And so on a variety of dimensions, childhood environment, quality of schools, but also the neighborhood you're living in, resources, really is central in understanding what drives mobility.
In terms of strategies, how do policymakers, how does government help to resurrect the dream of access to economic opportunity?
I think government can play a huge role precisely because government already plays a big role in trying to foster the American dream. We have a huge set of social programs on which we spend quite a bit of money. I mentioned affordable housing programs as one example. Another big example is support for higher education. I think thinking about how we more effectively design those programs to achieve the goals we attend, and then expanding the programs that are successful in an evidence-driven, data-based way is the path forward.
What made you decide to study income inequality?
My own interest in issues of income inequality really comes from my personal background. I grew up in India, the first part of my childhood, then moved to the United States. My parents came here very much motivated and by searching for the American dream, and just seeing the stark contrast in opportunities myself, it's totally obvious to me that I wouldn't have the opportunities I had today had I not been able to come to the US. I think has really just created a long-standing interest in studying these issues, and I'd like to figure out how to give more kids across the United States and around the world opportunities to succeed.
Professor Chetty, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, my pleasure.